evening and welcome. My name is Susan Engel, and I am the privilege of being the director of the lecture series here at the 92nd Street Y. Before I introduce tonight, I want to let you know about some newly added upcoming events. We have coming up next week the writer Neil Gaiman, and then we just announced President Musharraf, who will join Gideon Rose of Foreign Affairs on July 19th to discuss the future of Pakistan. I invite you to visit our website, www.92y.org, to order your tickets for these events, as well as for all our future events, including our fall lineup, which we will be announcing in the next couple of weeks. Now for tonight, I want to thank Thomson Reuters for sponsoring this very important event on the new threat, cyberterrorism. Thomson Reuters is always on the cutting edge, addressing the most timely and critical issues, and this is certainly one. I want to thank them, and particularly Steve Adler, for bringing us experts of such note and allowing us this unique opportunity to understand and learn. We all know Thomson Reuters as the place to go for the most reliable information, and as such, they are a wonderful programming partner with the 92nd Street Y. They also have wonderful people working for them. I particularly want to thank Patrick Flannery, who has been terrific in setting all this up from Thomson Reuters. And on the 92nd Street Y's side, Barbie Zakin, our special projects and sponsorship coordinator, who has managed many of the details of tonight's program as well. Of course, the vision behind this series is that of our moderator, Steve Adler, a longtime friend of the 92nd Street Y. As some of you know, he moderated our Captains of Industry series when he was with Business Week for many years. We have followed his incredible achievements with the greatest admiration and are thrilled to continue to have him now on our stage in this new capacity as Editor-in-Chief of Reuters News and Executive Vice President News. Thomson Reuters, in this capacity, he oversees the editorial operations and strategy for the company, and what a big job that is. We cannot imagine a partner more in tune with us and sharing the 92nd Street Y's essential values, namely commitment to community, giving back, and of course, education. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Adler.
Thank you very much, Susan, and good evening and welcome. We're here tonight to discuss cyberterrorism with a panel that includes some of our nation's leading experts on the topic. And this is one of those issues that typically gets swept off the radar screen when sexier things come along, like a certain current sex scandal. But it's also the sort of issue that we often wish we'd taken seriously and had tackled sooner rather than later. We've seen a disturbing flurry of cyber attacks these days against Google, Lockheed Martin, PBS, Sony, the IMF, Citi credit card holders, and even apparently, there was some stories the last couple of days, the CIA. And sometimes we know where the attacks are coming from, especially when they're launched by activist groups with causes to proclaim. But usually, in the vastness and confusion of cyberspace, we know little for certain about who is behind an incident or why. And it may, in fact, be the intrusions we don't even know about that will turn out to be the most dangerous. So how serious is the cyber threat? When is it a crime, and when is it terrorism? And when is it actually an act of war? And I guess most importantly for people here, what can we do to protect ourselves without at the same time entirely stifling ourselves? So we'll explore these questions with really extraordinary panelists tonight, and since we have 4 of them, I'm going to introduce them when they get to their seats. Also, you should remember the 92nd Street Y approach to question asking. You'll get a chance to put your questions on index cards, and they'll be brought up here towards the end, and you get a chance to ask some questions. So let me bring on stage our outstanding panelists, and then I'll introduce them when we're all seated. Thanks very much. Come on out. You can sit anywhere. Okay, so let me just quickly let you know who the panelists are, and I'll do this in alphabetical order, and that'll be confusing. So first is Frank Chalufo, who's second from the end here, and he directs George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute and all the activity at GW involving Homeland Security. And he joined GW in April 2003 from the White House, where he served as Special Assistant to the President for Homeland Security. On the far end is Mark Gordon, who's Chief Technology Officer for Bank of America, and he joined that firm in 2004 after extensive industry and consulting experience. And he's really helped ramp up the giant bank's information security efforts as financial institutions, as we'll talk about, have faced unprecedented cyber security threats. Then in the middle is Admiral Mike McConnell, who is now leader of Booz Allen Hamilton's intelligence business. Admiral McConnell served as director of the National Security Agency from 1992 to 1996, and then between 2007 and 2009, he was director of national intelligence. And if you want to talk about a large staff, he was responsible for an organization of 100,000 people and a budget of $47 billion. And finally, Mike Sheehan, CEO and founding partner of Lexington Security Group, which is a consulting firm that focuses on safety and security risk management. And Mike has served on the National Security Council as an aide to 2 presidents. He's been a senior diplomat at the State Department and the United Nations, and probably closer to our own hearts, between 2003 and 2006, he was chief of counterterrorism for the New York City Police Department. So please welcome our guests, and we'll get started with the conversation. I think I want to start by talking about what might be the most serious of threats. I think one of the things we talked about in advance was there's quite a range of concerns, which probably range from pranks to crimes, cyber theft, but all the way to cyber terrorism. And I was really struck that when Leon Panetta was having his confirmation hearing last week in the Senate, he said, quote, "The next Pearl Harbor that we confront could very well be a cyber attack that cripples America's electricity grid, its security, and its financial systems. The next Pearl Harbor coming from cyberspace." So I want to ask the panel, and starting with Admiral McConnell, do you agree with that? Is the threat so serious that you could potentially liken it to Pearl Harbor?
I do agree with the characterization, although I would qualify it just a bit. If there is a kinetic war, it will have cyber dimensions. And so if someone had made a decision that they were going to engage in a conflict with us, it could be in the form of a cyber Pearl Harbor. So that is a possibility. My greater concern is what I would label cyber espionage. Is when you are taking information for competitive advantage. And so while nation states who might engage in conflict with us will build cyber tools, cyber war tools to complement any kinetic war tools, they will also engage in cyber espionage, specifically cyber economic espionage, to secure competitive advantage for whatever they're attempting to do in a market context.
Mike Sheehan, if this is such an imminent threat, why isn't it part of the campaign discussion? Why isn't this a higher profile conversation?
Well, it increasingly is becoming a higher profile issue, and although I've been somewhat skeptical of some of the hype around cyber terrorism, I agree with Admiral McConnell. The bigger issue is on espionage and it's corporate and threats against industry. Having said that, terrorists certainly have been interested in cyber methods of attack for a long time. The good news is it's fairly difficult to do for a non-state actor. Normally it's states that have the type of technology that can execute these sophisticated types of operations, and non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and affiliates have not been able to generate any serious threat in that area. And even though terrorist groups that are associated with states, such as Iran and Syria, like Hezbollah, or other groups, Palestinian groups, also have had difficulty developing any serious cyber capability so far.
Just turn to Frank and talk a little bit more about this question of if the power can be in the hands of a very small number of people now, that the technology gives you the capability, even if you can't engage in cyber espionage, you can certainly do a lot of damage. Are we prepared to deal with that? Are we prepared to deal with the fact that a couple of people in a room with a computer can actually do a lot of damage? And how should we be thinking about that?
Sure. I mean, we've made some progress in recent years, but the ability to network has far outpaced our ability to protect networks. And I think it's important to get a bit of a rack and stack prioritization in terms of what threats are greater than others. And I agree very much with Admiral McConnell and Mike Sheehan on foreign counterintelligence issues are priority number one. By and large, you're looking at countries such as China, no surprise, perhaps being the most active, Russia perhaps being the most sophisticated. But I think it's important to recognize we don't live in a day and age where it's a kid with pimples drinking Jolt Cola all night who's breaking into our systems. We've got nations who are investing very heavily in cyber attack capabilities. Foreign criminal enterprises and transnational organized crime are getting more and more sophisticated and networked, and you're starting to see capacities there that are of real concern. Terrorist organizations, in addition to cyber attack tools, they are also in the business of using the internet to facilitate radicalization. I mean, the Anwar al-Awlakis, the bridge figures, the Omar Hamamis, they are very active in English, radicalizing and recruiting Americans to come to their jihadi cause. This is something we need to get our arms around. And I wouldn't discount that you could have a force multiplier where a cyber attack could be a force multiplier to a kinetic attack. And then, of course, you've got hacktivists. I mean, just read the newspapers with Anonymous or LulzSec. These same tools and techniques that others are using can easily be exploited by any actor. So you've got a wide range of threats. The tools are getting point and click. They're getting easier, and they're within the hands of many.
Yeah. So let's turn for a moment to the threat to the financial system and just to banks and banking clients. Mark, where are those threats coming from? Is it mostly crime? Are people trying to steal data just to sell it, or just what are you facing?
I mean, our lens is obviously a little bit different than the other panel members, but we actually see the whole spectrum. So we do see the high school jolt drinker, pimple ear or not. They're actually very capable and they've got tools. We see the social and political activists, the so-called hacktivists with various motivations. Obviously, cybercrime, both individuals, organizations, global organizations as well, that are looking to basically steal customer data and monetize it. And there's even a blurring in some instances with some of the nation-state threats in terms of in the future and over some horizon, there's an interest potentially in some of those players in the potential of destabilization, whether it's power, utilities, transportation, financial services. I think a variety of industries, I think, are at some point down the road potential targets that we'd have to be concerned about.
If there was a concerted attack on the financial system, do you think there's the capability of bringing down the system? There's a lot of talk about just how interconnected the banking world is and the financial world is, and that cyber attack could be a way really to, sort of almost through a back door to really undermine our security.
I think you never say never, right? But I don't think in today's world with the capabilities that are there, yes, there's a connectedness, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of players that operate relatively standalone environments. They do connect it in different places. I think it'd be very difficult to bring down the entire financial system in one stroke. Doesn't mean there wouldn't potentially be some disruption possibility, but I think that's really unlikely.
Yes.
Probably the greatest point of vulnerability would be the clearinghouses. Those
That's right.
The banks must reconcile. I mean, let's be clear, banking is based on confidence. The whole business cycle is based on confidence. So if you were successful in interfering with clearing, then banks would stop transactions, and then that could have a cascading effect. So there are points of vulnerability, but I agree with Mark. It would be difficult. broadly to do it, but if
Right.
you were very selective, you could have impact.
Yeah.
To piggyback Admiral McConnell's point there, though, I'm not sure you have to take down the system. If you undermine and erode trust and confidence in the system itself, if people aren't confident in banking, whether online or through ATMs and others, and you see a series of attacks, that is something we have to worry about. That's not a black swan that you can discount.
Yeah. And we have talked about the activists, and I'll just get the question over with early so you don't have to
Thank you,
wait
I
for it.
appreciate that,
But there was a ton of news, or at least news reports a few months ago about the notion that WikiLeaks had gotten hold of an enormous number of emails and other documents, and there was wide speculation that they were Bank of America
About Bank of America, right.
documents, and there was some reporting that you had put together, your firm had put together an enormous team to defend, and nothing much seems to have happened. What do you know at this point about what they have and what they're planning on doing with it?
We actually don't know. I mean, they've stated that they have content about Bank of America. We're not aware that they do or don't. I don't discount it. We take them at face value that they have something. We don't know what it is. We've done the diligence we think we needed to do in terms of trying to understand the possibilities and made sure we've had all the sort of risk capabilities in place, and we really know very little.
Yeah.
Pretty much as much as you know from what you've read in the news is about what we know.
Yeah. I wanted to focus first to kind of on what's the threat, just to look at the organization of the panel, and then talk about what we can do about it. But one thing I want to ask about in terms of what's the threat is, are the people on offense better than the people on defense? In other words, are the better hackers, the better computer scientists, the people who are causing us the trouble? Do we have people that good defending us?
Well, let me characterize it this way. To defend, you have to address every issue. If you're on the offense, you only got to find one. So I would say it's much easier to be on the offense. Now, the terms defense, offense are often confusing in this context. I like to use the words exploitation is a better way to describe electronic espionage. Nation states engage in that. The United States is as good at that or better than any other nation state in the world. Now that's different from cyber attack. If you're exploiting, it gives you a certain level of knowing secrets or intentions or finding terrorists or whatever your objective might be. In terms of defending, I think the United States at varying levels, whether it's government or business, we're among the best in the world, but the defender has to find every possible avenue, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. What's the most serious incursion that's occurred so far? I mean, what's the worst cyber attack that's, let's say, occurred against any entity in the U.S.? Mike?
I would think it's probably the stealing of defense technology is probably the most serious threat that we've had perpetrated against us. And again, following up on what Admiral McConnell said, I agree that it's much easier to attack, it's much easier to steal than to try to defend, just like in counterterrorism. It's very difficult to protect every building, every train station in New York City against a terrorist who can pick the time and place that we want to attack. And I think when we later on the panel, when we talk about how we respond to this, I think that's going to be very important to keep in mind that it's impossible to protect every vulnerability of an open society. And we're going to have to come up with a much more comprehensive strategy because of that circumstance.
So based on what you said, do you think our defense capabilities have been severely compromised as a result of that type of attack? Or that type of incursion where people stole defense information?
I think our defense industry has suffered losses of intellectual capital that is significant.
I would explain it a little bit differently, but agree with the point. The way I tend to explain it from my point of view is the nation has benefited significantly from the information technology revolution. We're more productive, our standard of living's gone up, we're more connected, all those good things. But in that, the goodness of the information technology revolution, we've introduced a level of vulnerability that can be exploited in a significant way. Mitigation of that vulnerability has not yet caught up with what needs to be done, and we're in that learning process now. We will discover this, we will debate it, we'll have meetings like this, legislatures are talking about it, but we have not yet had a galvanizing effect of some event that causes us to rally to action.
Steve, to pick up on that, I mean, from an economic espionage, foreign nations engaged in stealing secrets, and an industrial espionage perspective, I mean, if you think about it, if someone's spending lots of money in research and development and someone else can steal it for half the cost and then put that money into the market, it makes sense. And there have been some cases. I mean, it's hard to peel the onion too deep because there's no incentive for even the perpetrators and for the victims, obviously not the perpetrators, but the victims to compromise that as well. But I want to get to the biggest threat. I agree very much with Mike that defense secrets, of course, are on the top of anyone's short list. But there was an article, and it's not to take away from Reuters, but in the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago that was very powerful. And if accurate, there was a piece written by Siobhan Gorman that talked about what I would call the cyber equivalent of the intelligence preparation of the battlefield, that our electric power grid, which is the sugar daddy of all critical infrastructures that everything else to some extent is dependent upon, was identifying through SCADA systems and control systems where if they were to disrupt a technology, it would have a cascading effect, not just in the electric power. So when you look at nations that are doing the cyber intelligence preparation of the battlefield, if their intent changes, what you do from an exploitation perspective, if your intent changes, you just flip the switch and it's an attack tool. And that could have a really debilitating effect.
I mean, a lot of the attacks appear to be coming one way or another from China. There was a very interesting forum that Sir Harold Evans, who's here tonight, moderated, that Thomson Reuters sponsored a couple days ago, where both John Huntsman and Henry Kissinger were talking a lot about that issue, and I was surprised how much that issue came up in the discussion of China. Is that our biggest concern from a foreign standpoint?
China is prolific and noisy, so we know a lot about it. They are literally taking terabits of data, and it's critical information from defense industry, from the information technology sector, from virtually every sector. There are other nation states that are better, and so when they take things, they're not observed as frequently. So when you to reinforce the point Frank just made, when you understand nation states and their level of success and capability at the economic espionage or the electronic espionage level, and they're successful and you don't know how successful they are, turning that into an attack tool is just a matter of intent. So this is a very serious problem. And to build on the point Frank made, if you're going to be good at electronic espionage, you are going to survey the whole infrastructure, and you want to make it friendly to you. If you're a military planner, you want to make it vulnerable to you. So there are a whole series of activities going on by nation states today to take advantage of this vulnerability that has been introduced across all nations.
I have to ask, so who's better than China? Russia, okay.
Russia and China.
All right, well, let's talk about Russia, because we did do a story today that talked about quoting sources that Russian intelligence had been behind an attack on the U.S. Central Command and computer systems in 2008. Anybody know anything about that or have any more to say about Russian intelligence? Because we don't hear as much about that, frankly, as we hear about Chinese.
I read your article, and you were very careful to say that the government has not specified who it was, and you have speculated who it was. It was a sophisticated attack. It was very serious, and it was inside our command and control capability. The perpetrator was successful in getting in with a simple device called a thumb drive. Someone who lived on the inside classified world used a thumb drive to go out to the unclassified world. That thumb drive was infected, so when it went back into the classified world, it made it friendly to the perpetrator. Now, that was discovered. As far as we understand, I read the same article, it was shut down. But it was successful in making a penetration of our most secure system, so that's the point.
Yeah. And is you call it speculation, I think we quoted sources, is that good speculation?
It was, the sources were sources who were not authorized to speak on the record and spoke only on a condition of anonymity.
That happens from time to time.
It does indeed.
Occasionally. But Steve, I mean, historically there were previous attacks that emanated out of Russia, all the way back to Moonlight Maze before 2001. I want to say it was in the late 90s. Obviously, the attacks on the Estonian financial system. Obviously, the attacks in Georgia, the country, not Atlanta. So you have some cases to be able to look back to. But I think what Admiral McConnell mentioned that's most frightening, it's not just a technology issue, it's the convergence of various disciplines. I mean, Stuxnet allegedly was the same sort of thing with infected. It's where people meet technology, meet vulnerability, and that needs to be part of our response as well.
And I think it's important to distinguish. I like to group countries, and it's a little sloppy at times, but countries like China and Russia, which have the capability as major nation states with tremendous technology. And by the way, in China, I think the issue is their growth of their ability to continue to develop this capability. The good news about those nation states is they also play in the international system, so hopefully they're more rational actors that you can deal with. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the less rational states, the ones that are less predictable, the Irans or the North Koreas. Now, the good news is they don't have the capability, the engineers that the Chinese and the Russians have. But nevertheless, if they are able to develop a significant capability, they're less predictable. And so you have to come up with different strategies to counter a country like China, where you have such intense economic relationship with. The issue of cyber kind of falls down on the list when the president or the secretary of state is in there discussing a series of issues. Or an issue with Iran or North Korea, you can perhaps elevate it a little bit higher and continue to keep pressure on them to make sure that either as states they're not stepping out of bounds, or empowering non-state actors with some deniability to conduct attacks.
But our cyber really does kind of change the rules of war, doesn't it? If we are in fact, or if we in Israel, we don't know, or we're behind the Stuxnet attack, it had a very big impact on the Iranian nuclear program. If that had been a bombing raid, it would have certainly had a different response and a different impact. Are we thinking about how we use these tools offensively and what the rules are around that?
You're touching on an issue that speaks to attribution. Go back to the Cold War era. We had a policy of deterrence, and embedded in deterrence, although most people wouldn't think about it this way, is there was absolute certainty if there was an attack, you know from where it would emanate. And in the cyber world, attribution is probably the most difficult challenge. So the rules are evolving. And so allegedly there's an attack. How do you know it came from a specific perpetrator? One of the techniques is to move through the net multiple times. So if you ever look back, you only go back to the latest point of departure, not to the original source. So this is evolving, and we haven't yet sorted it out as a nation or as a globe on how we're going to deal with this.
But we need to.
Go ahead, Frank.
No, go ahead, Mike.
I want to follow up on Admiral McConnell. I think it's important to distinguish the technological responses to finding out who is and he's right, the issue of deniability is the key issue in cyber. It makes it so difficult, the deniability of where the attack came from. We need technological solutions to help us identify the source of the attack. But I would also argue strongly that we're going to need a political strategy in order to get at the issue. If we don't hold countries accountable, China has been thwarting international conventions on intellectual property, on the rules of the game for decades, and we have not held them accountable, and they continue to completely run outside of the boundaries of accepted behavior in a whole range of areas. We have to not only come up with technological answers, but hold people accountable to clean up their own space in order to have some type of control, so that they can't just say, oh, well, we don't know who did this, when we know generally it's coming from their geography. And that's going to be a difficult political issue.
Let me go one step further, because I agree very much with what Mike just conveyed there. I mean, we are still developing doctrine and rules of engagement, and we will continue. These aren't going to be set in stone anyway, like the commandment. I mean, that's something that's going to change based on technology. But we do need to start holding countries accountable. And they recently did release a new international strategy that did provide some indication that we will treat a cyber attack on par with a kinetic attack. And I think that's very important, because to me, I mean, who's behind that clickety-clack of the keyboard? You often don't know at the time whether you're dealing with a foreign intelligence service, a kid, a hacker, whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, we do know that through other sources, potentially, we can get information. And when we know that, we need to hold countries accountable.
And sometimes it's a blur of that, Frank, of whether sometimes nation states will use non-state actors
They
to
outsource it all the
give
time.
them the
Russia.
knowledge. And the Russians are the best.
Russians outsource that.
They allow their certain organized criminal syndicates to use instruments with their sort of a distant blessing. And they have to be held accountable.
Absolutely right. And we need, I would argue, strategic ambiguity to some extent in our, because you won't necessarily know what the impact or the effect is, but that there better be a deterrent or a compellant in place that it is unconscionable and unacceptable.
Let me just go a couple more questions on the nature of the threat, and then we'll move right into where you're naturally heading, because you're excited about what we can do about it, and we all want to hear about that. I guess one of the effects of cyber attacks that aren't necessarily military cyber attacks is the sense that it's going to stifle innovation. There's a lot of work about bringing information into the cloud, but that the cloud may be less secure. A lot of the exciting work that's been done in the last 10 or 15 years in this whole world of cyberspace is being affected by the concern that almost anything you do might create new openings to get into. Is that something, Mark or Frank or others, that you're experiencing, you're concerned about, that the kind of innovation that would be helpful to you is somewhat constrained by some of these threats?
Actually not. I mean, for us, I would say it hasn't been a constraint. In fact, I think depending on, people mean different things by the cloud, and we could spend an hour in terms of what, we have 5 of us here, is probably 6 definitions of what we mean by the cloud. But you could actually argue that the cloud is, depending how you define it, is actually more secure in some contexts. And so I haven't seen that there's been any sort of impact to innovation. In fact, in some ways the opposite. There's been a tremendous amount of innovation on the defensive side, and in fact, we've seen just massive growth in the intellectual capability that's being applied against protecting customer client data, in our case, as an example. And it's a great, by the way, from an economic perspective, it's a growth industry. I mean, we've got 25% plus growth in terms of the skill sets. We have a shortage of the skills in that space, and actually it's drawing a tremendous amount of innovation into it.
Steve, I would argue that done properly, the cloud can offer better service with a higher level of security. Now that takes some thoughtful planning and engagement and so on, but I think it can be done. I want to make another point. Many will pick up this dialogue as an assault on anonymity and use the cases like the activity in Iran when the government was suppressing its own citizens, or the overthrow of the government in Tunisia or Egypt. So that's goodness, and you want anonymity. I don't disagree with that you need, we benefit from a level of anonymity that is prevalent in the internet. That said, if it's a critical infrastructure, if it is something like banking or electric power or transportation or whatever, I would argue that as a citizen, I want to insist that the operators give up their anonymity. I want to have things like authentication and data integrity and sort of the basics of security. So on the one hand, cloud could be designed in a way that gives us better service at less cost with greater security, but there have to be some rules. Now here's a way to think about it. The military and the intelligence community and the government ride the same pipes that everybody else rides. They've established a process that the military calls .secure. The intelligence community calls it .whatever, the intel, or how they label it. We're on a path to do that for the federal government called .gov. Should we have something called .secure for the critical infrastructures? I would argue, as we mature on this dialogue and our give and take and our understanding, we'll move away from sort of the debate about my personal anonymity. You can have that, but for important things that would impact many, many citizens, I think we'll get around to realizing you want to protect that at a higher level of integrity.
Okay. Well, one last question on the nature of the threat, and then let's move to some of these remedies. I'm a little surprised that the panel seems somewhat dismissive of the ability of small groups to have a large effect because
Not all panel members were
Okay,
dismissed.
And
So
I'm
not
not sure
dismissive.
that's,
Okay.
I don't think
Not
anyone's
dismissive.
dismissive. It's
And-
racking and stacking in terms
Okay.
of
Relative.
privatization.
Relative.
One didn't
Good.
speak on it, so.
All right, let's come back to that for a minute because at least what this, some of the events that are in the news seem to be coming from hacker groups, from people with ideological concerns, sometimes from probably very small groups of people who, frankly, for perhaps just reasons of mischief, maybe once you would have written graffiti and now you take down the PlayStation platform. But the ability of small groups of people to have a great impact just by being good at this stuff seemed to me at least to be what was behind some of the types of attacks we're seeing. Can we just talk about that? And also the analog to that would be that a terrorist group without an enormous infrastructure but with a few really smart people could probably have an impact. Just some conversation around that.
Well, the point I would make is the cost of entry is relatively low.
Right.
And the numbers of people that have to do something that could cause major damage is a fairly small number of people. So even nation states that do this with very sophisticated tools are using relatively small numbers.
Right.
So the question is, with a small investment and the right brain power, could you get into what I would call the soft underbelly of the country? And I think that is a threat. Now, from my classified days, what I'll share with you is extremist groups were interested in weapons of mass destruction, and it's the usual list, nuclear, biological, chemical, and so on. Also, serious dialogue about cyber weapons. Now, talking about it and doing it are two different things, but if you're talking and the cost of entry is low, I would say that threat is increasing over time. Let me add one other dimension. There are 200 nations in the world, give or take a few. 180 of them or so, 170, have a very sophisticated, a reasonably sophisticated signals intelligence capability. Know what my neighbor's doing. I want to know my neighbor's secrets. There's somewhere around 25 to 35 that are building cyber attack tools. Mm-hmm. What happens when a tool, a virus, something meant to degrade or destroy, is released inadvertently? Because that's going to happen sooner or later. And once released, I mean, it's viral.
Yeah.
So there's a level of vulnerability that goes from nation state to individual terrorist group, extremist group who wants to change the world order. This is a serious issue that we'll have to mitigate in time.
And that is one of the big impediments, and I would argue we need to be ahead of the rest of the world offensively. I would make that case very powerfully and believe in it very much so. But to utilize and compromise certain tools, because once it is out there, it's only a matter of time where you have the bad guys playing with the good stuff.
Yeah.
And that convergence is really what we're talking about.
Yeah. To start moving into the question of remedies, Frank, you've written about how technology advances faster than policy and that we have real issues with getting our arms around this because there's an arms race on technology, and I think we're really struggling with figuring out what to do with it. You've got private pipes and public issues, and you have private data and you have public data, and it's all mixed around, and there's no clear system. Can you talk about that issue and how you see us working our way through that?
Sure. I mean, there are no easy answers, obviously, and to me, though, if you had to try to sum it up in a three sort of category, you've got policy. You need to have strong policies that have where security is not an afterthought or a footnote in one's development. And I would argue it could actually be a flight to quality, why someone would want to invest or support or go to a certain event or another. People, it's not so much a technology, it's not as much of a technology issue, I think, as many would think. Even on the security and law enforcement side, I would rather have a good human source. I would like to penetrate a criminal enterprise, a terrorist organization, a foreign nation, and use technical means and other sorts. But you also need those that are responsible for defending our systems to make sure they're doing all that they need to do. And I feel to some extent, not only do we need to look to incentives, but I also think there should be a disincentive role there, which is a complex one. And then it is a technology issue. How do you bundle and enable the various technologies? How do you have a workforce that's up to speed with where things are going? And obviously, as much as we like to separate the .gov and the .com world, it's not as easy or clean cut to be able to separate. There's certain things we can run that don't have connections to others, but as we saw with your story, allegedly that you had a thumb drive compromise a secure system, we've got to start thinking about these issues differently. And I would just add, I'll stand where I sit, education, education, education.
I would agree with that, and I would add one other dimension. What I captured from Frank's comments, it's a policy issue, it's operations, it's human capital, it's technology, it's management, culture, and so on. One other dimension, authority. We're a nation of laws. Departments in the government do what they're authorized to do. They can't do more than they're authorized to do. Well, we have now an issue that respects no boundaries, for which in an authority sense, departments have been set up with very strict boundaries. And I'll use the ones I'm most familiar with. Title 10, Department of Defense. If you're mad at someone, you want to use your resources to carry out your will. So in a context of an attack, Secretary of Defense, Department of Defense, Title 10, that's how you would manage that process from an authority standpoint, oversight by the Congress. Title 50, you want to exploit, you want to know what the bad guys are doing and what they're up to. Title 50, you exploit it. If you're going to defend the country domestically, Title 6, that's the Department of Homeland Security. If it's a law enforcement issue, that's Title 18. Now, I've just...
And one more title, 32.
Well, 32 also, for the National Guard and how would you use that and so on. But what I've just described, and I'll use one agency as my example, the last time I looked, the Department of Homeland Security had 78 oversight committees. So now can you imagine a threat this complex that crosses boundaries, that have this many chairpersons and ranking members attempting to legislate or oversee the process when the issue of cybersecurity respects no boundaries at all. So we've got a very convoluted authorities picture, and there are bureaucratics involved in arguing how would you get it resolved so that the government can do its side to engage appropriately with the public or the private enterprise for a public-private partnership, which I think will be required to solve this issue.
Right. So I mean, I think part of your point is that if the threat is against the electric grid or is against a private financial system, you probably need government help to solve it, right? But you don't actually have a mechanism to provide it because it's not quite the same as going to war against somebody.
Well,
maybe you do.
Let me give an intel guy's slice.
Yeah.
If it's foreign, it's a foreign country, nation state, whatever, that's initiated an attack. Where do you have an institution who's authorized and appropriated to break code to read the bad guy's mail? It's only one place, National Security Agency. The National Security Agency is restricted to foreign. It has no domestic role. So if the National Security Agency were to observe a foreign country attack electric power or transportation, they were powerless to do anything about it. Now, if they have information that would be useful, how do you get that information into the Department of Homeland Security and used in a way that engages with the private sector to do the appropriate defenses? And because the authorities are like I just described them, and the bureaucratic interests prevail, we're assured that we can't cross those bureaucratic boundaries.
Yeah. So, I mean, are we talking about legislation? And it's hard to imagine this Congress taking on a matter of this complexity.
You've now described the problem. This is very
complex. It is both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. The executive branch was slow to get its own house in order, lead by example. There's still a lot of discussion in terms of, there's been a lot of noise, ironically, by the two largest perpetrators, China and Russia, to come up with an arms control-like treaty in cyberspace. Sans attribution or lack the ability to do attribution, to me, that's a debacle. I'll go back to Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. And I don't trust, and we can't verify, so not a good plan.
So you see no opportunity for a kind of détente or a treaty set up? There's no way to figure out a way to organize that would work right now?
I probably take a different position than some of my colleagues here, but I would argue that the best response is A, the ability to reconstitute very quickly as well, regardless of who the perpetrator is, and B, that we need to stay ahead offensively.
I would agree with the reconstitution question. That's absolutely essential. That requires resources and priorities, and that will be a subject of debate. I do believe that nation states who are engaged in market activities in a productive way, at some point there's going to be a realization that there's higher level of self-interest in a structure that's dependable and works than stealing the other guy's information. And so I'm hopeful, maybe Pollyannish, but I'm hopeful that in time we'll be able to work out some sort of an agreement. Now, everyone's talked about China tonight. Let me just make my point. China holds $1 trillion in U.S. debt. It's not in China's interest for the United States to have a destabilized economy. Well, in China, just like anywhere else, you've got various agencies, and you include the military. Well, the military is always going to be preparing for the next conflict, whatever they think that is. Well, just read what they say. The soft underbelly of the United States is the dependence on the cyber infrastructure. So they're going to exploit and develop tools just in case. And how do you mitigate that? That's sort of the question of the future.
And let me follow up on that. We have to be very, very careful how we pursue this. I do believe that China and Russia can be kept inside the international system, and I think they have a great interest to remain within it, although they're going to push the boundaries where they see to their advantage. And one of the problems that we face with cyber is if they decide to cheat extensively on this, we can build all sorts of agreements, and we can spend tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars in defending ourselves, and we can bankrupt ourselves when really I believe that the key part of this is going to be political will to keep them in line, and for them to have an incentive to play by the rules, because I think it's going to be impossible, especially with China, when you look at the engineering capacity that they're developing over the next generation or two, to try to stay ahead of that, we could bankrupt ourselves. We really can't afford right now to pile another whole multi-$100 billion program on top of a national security budget that's already strained, nor can we afford to put an onerous burden on the private sector that's trying to compete against the very people that aren't playing by the rules. So I go back again, we come from where we sit. I've served in the State Department. Politically, we have to raise this issue up the pecking order in order to hold these countries accountable, or we'll wind up bankrupt ourselves trying to catch up with their cheating.
Yeah, I want to stay with you for a moment, Mike, because you wrote a book called Crush the Cell. I always like promoting people's books. and in it you talk about how terrorists succeed when we overreact. And so are cyber attack an area where we're underreacting?
It's a little different.
Or how do you see that?
On terrorism, I always make the point that terrorists are inherently weak, and they attack your psyche by attacking and killing civilians. And when you overreact to a terrorist attack, you actually amplify an organization that really doesn't have power. And so I've always cautioned against overreacting to an Al-Qaeda attack or any other type of terrorist attack. And the Israelis are the best at this in the world. They never overreact to attack by terrorists. They get on with their life right away, and they send a signal back to the terrorists: you are not going to disrupt our life. We're going to get on with it. And we need to take a page out of the way how they react to terrorist attacks in a much more steady way. Cyber is a little bit more difficult, but I do believe there are some lessons in terrorism, in countering terrorist attacks or sort of quasi-terrorists, and that is, like Frank said, you got to go after the organization. You got to hold them accountable. And you have to be very aggressive in trying to take down these organizations early on before they develop an increased capability. Al-Qaeda tomorrow would love to use a chemical, radiological, nuclear, biological, or cyber device. But the reason it's going to be difficult for them to develop that is because they're under enormous pressure around the world by intelligence services. I think we might be able to take a page out of that playbook against these organizations, these capacities that are starting to bubble up and grow, that we really have to take on those organizations as an organization, not just technologically, and make them pay, make them suffer for what they're doing, and not allow them to develop an even more dangerous capability.
Just with you as the New York expert, is New York a particular target for cyber warfare, or is that too narrow? It's not really where the action is.
Oh, no question about
It
it.
is,
New
yeah.
York has a lot of the clearing spots that the Admiral was talking about.
Financial capital of the world.
This is the center of so much activity, a center of so much technology, of information, of finance, that we remain in the crosshairs again, not only from Al-Qaeda type terrorists, but also cyber.
See,
This is
could I,
good.
could
Yeah,
I,
go
do-
ahead.
I want
Yeah.
to offer just a slight variation on the point that Mike Sheehan made with regard to the cost. There's a way to think about security from my vantage point as an enabler. I am a true believer in what the IT revolution did for the country. Now, let's go back to the 70s. Things didn't look real good for the United States in the 70s. People were writing about the demise of the United States and so on. And the Japanese had discovered dimming, and they could make cars better and faster and cheaper and so on. So we were going through a period there. We were starting to look at ourselves as our time come, and the IT revolution put us clearly out front again. My argument would be that when you think about the cost of security in an IT infrastructure, it's not a huge percentage. And so if you build it in, it becomes an enabler for staying on this IT revolution. So I just think about it a little bit differently. And we currently, if we had a chart of the world up here, and with the U.S. on center, and we put bandwidth on top of that, that's how I tend to think about it, because I'm a code breaker, right? So if you look at it that way, we're the center of the universe. And so continuing that centric performance on our part, innovation and so on, I think we have to consider the security aspects as the enabler to allow us to have this prominent position.
Just one point on that very briefly, and I agree. And I actually think they actually are closer aligned.
Oh, yeah.
But one thing, I mean, we really haven't done a good job making the business case for cybersecurity. And that's not something government can do alone. Again, lead by example, get their own house in order. But I believe there is an incentive approach, but also a disincentive approach. Authority, accountability, and resources. Policy without resources is rhetoric. And if you look at where the money's going, it's not necessarily going where it ought to. But I think the insurance sector and the reinsurance sector could play a more significant role here. I'd like to get the bar, raise it high. When you meet that bar in a critical infrastructure by critical infrastructure, if you do raise that bar, then you should get get incentives or a good housekeeping seal of approval. There are many different ways to slice it, but I don't think we've been creative. And shame on us.
How much does public support matter, public opinion? It's in the air, but it's not something that I think if you looked at any poll of the issues in the election, it wouldn't come up high. Do we need to face an obvious, serious attack before people get concerned about this?
Let me share an observation for a guy who's been in this business for 45 years, serving presidents and secretaries of defense and chairman of the Joint Chief and so on. This is the thing I learned as a young intel officer years ago. What's the first thing that those individuals do every day? The first thing, before they get their intel brief, they look at the front page of the major newspapers. Why? They want to know what the public thinks. So you ask, what's the public role? Absolutely essential. Panels like this will help to eliminate and illustrate and so on, but this is America. And if we're going to do something, it's a resource game. And so everybody's got to give up something or whatever. So generally, how we do these things is we talk and don't act. We wait for the catastrophic event, whatever that is, and then it's, oh my God, where were you and what did you know and when did you know it and what are you doing about it?
Yeah.
And then we're going to overreact. So I think it would be useful for us, for once, to recognize this is coming.
Yeah.
Let's sit down and have a logical, thoughtful process to do what we need to do.
Let me just ask one more question and then go to questions from the audience. There has been a lot of coverage lately of what's an appropriate U.S. attack to a cyber attack on us and when would it be appropriate to attack with conventional weapons against a cyber attack. And I think there's likely to be some announcements on that from the government. What is all of your view on when, under what circumstances it would be appropriate actually to go to war because somebody's attacking us in the cyberspace?
I think it's very careful. We need to be very careful about terms. You said attack. Okay, attack means different things to different people, is economic espionage, where you took critical information out of a major company in this country for your advantage. Is that an attack? I would say that's not an attack.
Not an attack.
That's espionage. Now, same scenario, but when you entered the database where you were going to get it for competitive advantage, you decided to destroy the data, and it had some major impact. Now I think you've crossed the Rubicon of attack in that sense of destruction, data destruction. My view is where we're most vulnerable is in the destruction of data. And so if there's a penetration that results in data destruction, it's what's the magnitude of that destruction, and then based on whatever that is, you'd have to have, in my view, a proportional response.
Which begs the question, if the Russian attacks either directly or indirectly on Estonia, and I might, for transparency, I've got some Estonian blood in me, so, but at the end of the day, would that have triggered Article 5 in the NATO context as an act of war? Based on what I just heard, that actually could have, but would we have the political will to be able to respond? I would argue here we want some strategic ambiguity. We want to make clear we will respond, but we don't want to necessarily provide telltale indicators or tie our hands necessarily. But there are cases where a cyber attack, a form of cyber warfare could trigger kinetic and other responses.
We may wind up in a world where you have, for instance, using the Russian case, where they appear to have empowered non-governmental actors to do some of their dirty work for them. It is going to be an ambiguous situation of ambiguity, and our response might be the same. And we may be able to even have responses that, which we have done in the past, where the receiver of our cyber attack doesn't know where it's coming from. But there may be a wink and a nod to them to say that. So we're entering a whole new realm of military type action, where the people actually executing the event are not clearly identified.
Some have argued that the activity with regard to Estonia was not an act of war. It was a denial of service process. Therefore, they filled up a channel so you couldn't communicate, but they didn't destroy anything. So that would be in the NATO context, Article 5, it'd be a never-ending argument. Was it an act of war or not an act of war? And we haven't worked through that dialogue.
And if you knew for sure where it was coming from. I mean,
and
one can strongly
attribution,
suspect
always
it, but you
the
don't
attribution
necessarily
question.
know.
And if it came from Russia, did it came from the nation-state Russia or from some hacktivists in Russia? And that's, again, the ambiguity question.
Very murky. Okay, question from the audience. Is there an effective deterrent strategy for cyber terrorism, especially if it is state-sponsored? And if you could be more specific about how we would deter cyber terrorism.
Well, I've written on this quite a bit and thought about it. I think deterrence of cyber warfare, nation-state to nation-state, is achievable. I don't think deterrence of cyber terrorism is achievable. Now, what do I mean by that? Small group would engage in suicide activities to further their cause. Are you likely to deter that group given that they've got a cyber capability? I think not. So what we will have to do is start to think about awareness to the level of breadth and timeliness that you could preempt. That's a very different way to think about it. We don't, as Americans, we don't normally think about it that way. Closest we've been was the previous administration, and if you harbor terrorists, we're going to take action to protect ourselves. So that's another line of reasoning in this cyber dimension. If you cannot deter, and that small group could do major damage, is your only course of action preemption.
And I think that the post 9/11 environment, where the U.S. government has done things in terms of intervention, in terms of attacking terrorist infrastructure in a way that was absolutely off the table prior to 9/11, might open up some thinking about how we might preempt in cyber particularly if we believe that something catastrophic may be around the corner, and it might be, you know, if you just think about if we had preempted and knocked off bin Laden in 1999, if we had an armed predator at that time, it would have been a very different world. And perhaps the new changing event like that might be some type of preemptive activity to prevent a catastrophic cyber attack if we saw that capability and intent, the capability and intent coming together. A president of the United States would have a very difficult decision of whether they would have to take preemptive action overseas and to try to defend ourselves. And I think there is under international law, that would be justified if you could make the case that you're acting in self-defense.
I would just note, we don't have a formal deterrence strategy, and we should.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not the same as nuclear deterrence with mutual assured destruction and other, but there are some similarities, and I would argue that we actually need to work toward having a coherent deterrence strategy where we do spell out precisely what some of these options are. I might also note, and I agree with everything on the countryside, but there are some, the Council of Europe, for example, with organized crime, there are some areas in terms of behavior where we can come at it from the very high end and from the lower end. It's those in-between ones that get very difficult.
The administration a few weeks ago released a strategy for international engagement on cyber issues, and they were pretty specific about an attack there would be an accountability and an appropriate response. So as a nation, the most senior policymakers are grappling with this issue, and it's not completely formalized yet in what our policy will be.
Okay. Let me just take, I've got two more audience questions, and then we'll finish up. The first is, what's the proper role of the local police in the national security arena, and especially regarding cyber terrorism, as opposed to the national, the federal operations? I think that question's probably for you.
Yeah, well, obviously, even NYPD, the most sophisticated police department in the United States, has very limited capacity in this. Although we had an actually pretty good cyber crime unit that I worked with when I was at NYPD that helped deal with companies that were under different types of unsophisticated attacks. But we would always have to call in much more sophisticated federal partners to do that. So I think the local police department's role is basically staying in touch with the business community, staying in touch with folks, and trying to keep the awareness level and staying connected to the much more capable federal partners.
And on the federal side, I mean, the Bureau, the FBI, has enhanced its ability where they send agents devoted entirely to cyber crimes to some of the hotspot areas in Romania, Colombia, the Netherlands, Ukraine, Estonia, and elsewhere. That has actually met and netted real arrests, and there are some cases at the federal level as well as state and local.
Although even that hasn't, they could have done a lot more, Frank, in that area. I'm glad you raised that, because we could do a lot more in that area to help other nation states police its own borders. Bring up, they really, a lot of these countries have shown a desire to do so. They just don't.
It's like your INL days.
They need a little help.
Exactly.
Yeah, they need a little help, and I think there's a lot of room for work there.
Yeah.
So can I add a thought? As the guy sitting in the national seat, my thought with regard to state and local police is it's incumbent on the federal government to clear. Clearance is always a big issue. Well, they're not cleared. Well, clear them. I mean, they're American citizens. They'll take an oath. They're not felons. So the only requirement for a clearance is to grant it. So the federal role should be to clear them first. Second, share the information, and then insist on a level of coordination and collaboration where you're more effective both ways. I would basically change the culture. In my world, the watchword is need to know, which means I decide if you have a need to know, meaning another way to say it is it's my information, I don't have to share it. I think our culture should be driven to an attitude of responsibility to provide. If I have information, I need to find out who needs it, wherever they are out there, and get it to them. That's my job. And so when Frank was going through his list earlier about policy and operations and human capital, this is a human capital cultural issue that we're going to have to deal with as a nation to share information across these boundaries.
I think, as an example of that, Admiral, when I was at NYPD and I was worried about bio, I tried to get the location of where the high-level pathogens were stored in New York City, and CDC was the holder of that information. I tried for 6 months for them to tell me where it was. I couldn't get it. I sent 2 detectives, drove down there in a Crown Vic. I said, don't come back from Atlanta until you find out where they are. I said, I don't care if you got to tow their vehicles away or do something. And, these are, your typical NYPD sergeants and lieutenants. They got it. And I won't get into the details, but they're here. Those pathogens are here in this city, and guess what? They weren't protected. So we did have a role. We helped the private sector in basic things like providing a little bit of security around these hospitals that had some very dangerous materials in them, and kind of going through, hey, who are your employees that have access to these materials? Same thing on cyber. We can, the local guys, we kind of know the industries here. We know the big banks. We know the big clearinghouses. We can work with them and help them if we have a little help from the federal government. We can, rather than have to send 2 cops down and threaten them to get the information, we had to draw it out of them.
Violent agreement on this one.
Okay, maybe we'll end it on the violent agreement. This is clearly a continuing conversation. It'll be interesting to see whether we get a handle on it or we don't, and it's probably a conversation we'll want to have quite often as we try to figure out what to do. So thank you for being here. Thanks to the guests. Thank you all for joining us today.